The night the sky split open over Red Hollow Ranch, no one was praying louder than her, and no man had ever been more terrified than the rancher who stood bleeding in the mud with the storm, crashing down like judgment itself. The words, "Amen. Please, faster," harder spilling from her lips, not in desire, but in raw, desperate faith as the wind howled, the horses screamed, and the barn doors slammed like gunfire. Because this was not a night for mercy, it was a night for survival. And everyone on that land knew it. The rancher, Caleb Horn, had faced rustlers, drought, bullets, and betrayal, but nothing prepared him for the moment the river broke its banks and came, roaring toward the homestead, turning dry desert into a roaring black ocean. And when he saw her running barefoot through the rain, clutching a lantern, praying with every breath as if God himself was riding beside them, he realized this night would either kill them or change them forever. Caleb shouted for her to get back. His voice ripped away by thunder, but she kept coming, shouting back prayers instead of fear, begging him to move faster, to strike the gate harder, to drive the horses harder, because the water was already at her knees and the barn roof was beginning to groan. Caleb's hands shook as he forced the gate open, muscles screaming, every breath a knife in his lungs, fear clawing his chest not for himself but for her, because she believed in him in that moment more than she believed in anything else, and that belief was heavier than the storm. They fought the flood together, him dragging ropes and lifting beams, her guiding terrified animals through chaos, her voice never stopping, whispering amen like a weapon, against death itself. And when the final horse broke free and the barn collapsed behind them in a roar of wood and water, Caleb staggered, vision blurring, legs giving way as the adrenaline drained from his body, and he fell face first into the mud, rain pounding his back like a hammer while she dropped beside him, pressing his head to her chest, still praying, still whispering thanks, still believing. And in that moment, as the storm screamed above them and the ranch lay broken around them, Caleb Horn finally let go, his body surrendering to exhaustion so deep it felt like sleep or death. And the last thing he heard before darkness took him was her voice saying his name like a promise. Caleb woke to silence so complete it frightened him more than the storm, his body stiff, every muscle burning as if he had fought the night itself. And when he opened his eyes, dawn was breaking over a ruined ranch, sunlight touching broken fences, scattered tools, and muddy footprints that proved the nightmare had been real. But what grounded him was her hand gripping his, warm and steady, as she sat beside him on the porch steps wrapped in his coat, eyes red from crying and praying and refusing to sleep until she knew he would wake. She told him how he had collapsed completely, how she had dragged him inch by inch out of the floodwater, how she had begged God not to take the only man stubborn enough to stand against the storm. And Caleb listened in silence because no one had ever fought that hard for him before. No one had ever prayed for him like that, and the weight of it settled in his chest heavier than exhaustion. As the town arrived one by one, neighbors, riders, men who once doubted him, they saw the damage and the miracle both. Because the ranch still stood, the people still lived, and the animals were saved. And they understood that what happened that night was not just strength. It was will, faith, and the refusal to quit when everything said surrender. Caleb tried to stand and nearly fell again, his body reminding him that courage has a cost. But she steadied him, whispering the same words she had spoken during the storm, not pleading now, but grateful. And as he leaned on her, he realized collapse was not weakness. It was proof he had given everything he had. Later, when the sun climbed higher and the town began repairs, Caleb addressed them not as a hero, but as a man who had been afraid, who had almost broken, and who had been held up by faith that was louder than fear. And when he finally looked at her, really looked, he understood that the storm had not just tested the ranch. It had revealed what truly mattered. The story of that night spread beyond Red Hollow, growing with each telling. But Caleb never corrected the exaggerations, because the truth was enough. He had been terrified. He had pushed himself beyond reason. He had collapsed in exhaustion, and he had survived, because someone believed hard enough for both of them. And as the camera of memory pulls back from the rebuilt ranch, from the man standing stronger, than before beside the woman who prayed him. Through the storm, the lesson lingers clear and powerful. Sometimes, the hardest nights forge the strongest souls, and sometimes faith sounds like whispered words in the rain, asking you to keep going just a little longer. The days after the storm were harder than the night itself, because storms leave adrenaline behind, but dawn leaves truth. And Caleb Horn discovered that exhaustion does not end when you wake up. It settles into the bones and weights. The ranch looked familiar but felt foreign, like a battlefield after the dead have been counted, and every step he took reminded him of the moment his body had failed. The moment fear had taken his breath and forced him to the ground. And though the town praised him, though they called him strong and fearless, Caleb knew the truth. He had been terrified, and that terror had not vanished with the floodwaters. At night he woke sweating, hearing thunder that wasn't there, seeing water rushing toward him even in silence, and it was her voice that anchored him again and again, steady and calm, reminding him that survival did not mean weakness, that collapsing did not erase courage, that even the strongest men are allowed to fall. But the land did not wait for healing. Fences needed rebuilding, cattle needed sorting, and debts did not forgive storms. So Caleb pushed himself too soon, lifting when he should have rested, riding when his body begged him not to, until one afternoon his legs buckled again, not from fear this time, but from refusal to listen. And when he sat in the dirt staring at his trembling hands, he finally understood the truth the storm had tried to teach him. Strength without limits becomes destruction, and endurance without faith becomes loneliness. That night, sitting by the fire, he spoke for the first time about the fear he carried, about the moment he thought he would die. And instead of judgment, he found understanding, and instead of shame, he found relief. Because survival is not just about standing, it is about admitting you almost didn't. Just when the ranch began to breathe again, danger returned wearing a human face. Because storms do not destroy everything, and the men who had watched Red Hollow suffer from a distance now saw opportunity in its weakness. Rustlers came at dawn, confident that a tired rancher and a half-rebuilt fence meant easy profit. But they misjudged one thing. They mistook exhaustion for defeat. Caleb felt fear again when he heard the shots. But this time it did not paralyze him, it sharpened him, reminding him of the night he had already survived, the night he had already given everything. And as he stood his ground with the townsfolk at his side, he realized that collapse had not broken him. It had tempered him like steel. The confrontation was fast, brutal, and loud, dust and gunfire mixing with shouted warnings. And when it ended, the rustlers fled empty-handed, leaving behind nothing but proof that Red Hollow was not as fragile as it looked. Afterward, as Caleb leaned against the fence, catching his breath, he felt the familiar tremor of fatigue. But this time he did not fall, because he no longer fought it alone, and the town saw something different in him. Not a man who never breaks, but a man who rises anyway. Word spread that Red Hollow was not a place to test, not because of weapons or numbers, but because of the will of the people who stood there, bound by a night they had survived together. Years later, when the ranch stood stronger than it ever had, when fences were straight and barns solid and laughter returned to the land, Caleb often walked the riverbank where the storm had once tried to take everything, and he understood now why that night remained with him, not as fear, but as foundation. The collapse that once haunted him became the story he told younger hands, not as warning but as truth, teaching them that pushing forward is noble, but knowing when to lean on others is wisdom. The words she had spoken that night, amen whispered into chaos, became a quiet tradition at Red Hollow, spoken before hard rides and dangerous work, not as superstition but as remembrance, because faith is not always loud and courage is not always clean. When Caleb looked back on his life, he did not measure it by victories or losses, but by the night he stood in a storm, gave everything he had, collapsed in exhaustion, and woke to find that falling had not ended his story, it had deepened it. And as the sun set over the land that once tried to drown him, the lesson remained clear for anyone willing to listen. The hardest moments do not define you by how long you stand, but by what you become after you rise again.